Welcome to Chapter 8, Part 2, where we'll take a look at the planning and construction of the railway across Canada, which ties together everything we talked about in Confederation and kind of just wraps it up nicely. So in order for the country of Canada to continue spreading west, the two sides needed to be connected, and the best way at the time to do that would be building a railway across the entire continent from the east coast to the west coast. British Columbia actually would not join Confederation until there was a railway stretching to the west coast. However, building a railway 5,000 kilometers across mountains and swamps and muskeg and plains would be extremely difficult. It would be quite a task to accomplish today, so let alone building it back in the mid-1800s. So it starts with planning. So people called surveyors traveled across the country collecting information, taking measurements, thinking, planning, and testing ideas in order to find the best route for the railway to take. This was a very difficult job. These guys were working in either small groups or on their own, facing things like wild animals, natural things like the cold in the wintertime or extreme heat in the summer. They had to climb mountains or figure out how to get through the mountain passes, up and down rivers, possibly rapids, wading through swamps. And then since there's no hotels in those areas back then, camping out in the wilderness. So they had to answer some questions and consider some questions in the planning process, and the information the surveyors collected helped with this. So the biggest one was, is it better to take a shorter, cheaper route or a longer, more expensive, but possibly safer route? Should it run near or through good farmland and resources? They had to consider what towns the railway should run through and which towns the railway would not go through. That's a really serious question to consider because that could make or break a town. A town with a railway could prosper, become a lot bigger, attract new settlers, whereas a town without access to a railway could eventually end up as a ghost town because all the people have moved away to this larger developing town or city. They had to think about how close it should run to the United States, possibly even running into the United States, and all the consequences that could have. They had to figure out during construction how to get through the hard rock of the Canadian Shield. They had to figure out how to get through bogs and muskeg and swampland. They had to figure out how to get through the Rocky Mountains. Okay, did it go through them? Did it go up and over them? On doing so safely and getting down the slopes safely. And they also had to consider what the wild bison and horses on the plains, if they would cause problems. Massive herds of these animals, and as you'll find out, it certainly did cause some problems during the running of the railway. So, in addition to these surveyors, there were some men who played a pretty important role. They were extremely determined gentlemen. They worked hard, and they had to have a lot of imagination to figure out how this railway would look and the kind of impact it would have on the country. So we have William Van Horn, the chief engineer of the railway. Andrew Onderdonk, he was in charge of the BC section. And Major A.B. Rogers was one of the lead surveyors. They had to help answer the questions that I went over, and they had to have plans in place to actually solve these challenges. But it's one thing to plan a railway, and it's an entirely another thing to actually build it. So the workers involved, on a daily basis, they risked accidents, disease, malnutrition, even death during the construction of the railway. They had to build bridges across massive canyons and rivers. They had to use dynamite to blow up the rock, which had the potential of causing avalanches or landslides. They had to lay track across swampy land, and they had to deal with natural hazards such as bugs, mosquitoes, and black flies, or extreme weather, the hot in the summer, the freezing cold, and the snow in the wintertime. And they did all this with little pay. To kind of expand on the troubles or difficulties that they had, I mean, you could imagine how difficult it would be without the kind of the crane technology we have now to build a bridge across some of the canyons that you see, especially in the Rocky Mountain areas. Using dynamite. Most of these people were not trained to use dynamite. They were just given it and told to clear a path, which can lead to obviously some pretty serious injuries or death for these workers. If you read page 239, hopefully you remember the little quick story they have about railway tracks actually sinking into swampland, which in turn ended up sinking 3 locomotives at one point. So very expensive and dangerous hazard there. It doesn't go into a ton of detail in the textbook, but it does make mention of the Chinese workers that were brought in to work on this project. It was cheap labor for the Canadian government to bring in, because these people from China wanted a job. They wanted to start a new life in the developing country of Canada. And it was a good way to get a huge amount of labor to get this project completed. They were often given the most dangerous jobs and they received the littlest pay, but they did complete the project, although many people died in the process. Alrighty, so the next section, which I like to take a look at, is how did the railway actually affect the people of the country of Canada once it was completed. So it says the last spike signaling the completion of the railway was hammered in November of 1885. The first train, after it left the East Coast, arrived in Port Moody, BC. Maybe some of you have been there, on June 28th, 1886, which obviously a very exciting day for a train to make it all the way across the country. Biggest changes were certainly happening in the West, but there were also some pretty serious negative impacts. So I'll just bring this chart over. I made this one so you could see the whole thing. So some of the impacts. Towns and cities along its route grew bigger, right? They had access to the goods and services that the train brought, so more people would want to live near a railway hub. Tourism became a new industry. As most of you have probably been to the Rocky Mountains, you know why it's such a good tourist spot. This is how it came to be. People could travel from the east and see the majestic mountains. However, other places became ghost towns because the railway didn't pass through them. Less people would go out of their way to settle somewhere else. It was easier to settle close to the railway tracks and in the towns that were developing along the railway tracks. Farm products from the prairies could be sent east, which brought new produce and the like to the eastern provinces. However, some people's ways of life were destroyed forever. So if the railway ran through somebody's piece of land, they would obviously no longer be able to farm or ranch where they were, so they would be completely put out of business. It opened up the prairies and British Columbia to immigrants from all over the world. People could more easily move to the western areas. And the prairies in British Columbia were now linked to the rest of Canada, so they didn't have to go down into the States to travel west, as there was already railways developed in the United States by this point. And quite possibly the biggest negative that had a really wide wide effect was that almost all of the bison on the prairies were completely killed. And I'll go into that in a little more detail in a second. So the First Nations and Métis people is the next section we'll talk about. So the completion of the railway allowed farmers and settlers to move west, and it opened up tons and tons of new land for people to live on. But it also drastically changed the ways of life of the First Nations and Métis people who had been on that land in the prairies and British Columbia. They'd been there for a long time. For them, it was almost entirely negative consequences from the development of the railway. The bison were very important to the way of life of the First Nations and Métis, and the railway essentially decimated the entire population. That's just the first example. Farmers coming to the region also took over all the land that the First Nations people lived on and kicked them off. So the farmers that were there started making huge changes to the area that great for the settlers, but they were extremely negative for the First Nations people. So just another, get the full chart on here, which you have in your textbook. A little cause and effect. So one main purpose of the railway was to bring settlers to farm the plains and to build towns and cities, which is fantastic. But the effect of this on the First Nations people, the railway company or the Canadian government sold land to the new settlers. The farmers and settlers believed that they owned the land, but the First Nations and Métis had lived on the land for a long time. Now, the First Nations had to live on reserves, and they ended up losing their independence. So all the First Nations people had to be relocated because the Canadian government was selling the land that the First Nations were already on. Farmers did not want bison damaging their crops, so they sectioned off their land with barbed wire fences. Bison could no longer freely roam. That was the effect. And without the bison, the way of life of First Nations and Métis people were destroyed. Herds of bison traveling across the tracks could prevent trains from running on time, or an animal with a hoof caught in the track could cause an accident. So, railway builders encouraged the killing of bison herds on the plains. As a result, the people of the plains lost their main food supply, and they eventually faced starvation. So it was common for the train just to slow down, and somebody would shoot a bison or a wild horse approaching the tracks, so they wouldn't have to stop the train or have an accident by hitting an animal. So another cause, so trains caused damage. Horses were often hit by trains, and sparks came off the steam locomotives. So what was the effect of this? Horses were an important way of life, or important to the lifestyle of the Plains First Nations people, and the horses were just being killed one after another. And then the prairie fires were started by the sparks coming off the railway, and the fires were destroying grasslands and people's homes. So overall, it did not work out very well for the First Nations people. Okay, there we go. That's the last page. So it's just important to keep in mind that what we talk about as such an important and huge accomplishment for the country, while it had many positive effects, it also had a huge number of negative effects for certain groups of people in certain towns. And when we look back at history, it's really important to keep those positive and negatives in mind. And hopefully, when we go to conduct future projects like this in the future, we can maybe try to avoid some of the negative side effects or the negative consequences that we've already gone over in the past. So that's it for now. We'll talk to you next time.